Israel and Hamas had agreed a ceasefire this week, until they hadn't. A court struck down President Trump's tariffs, and then that ruling was struck down. We'll look at these pretty dramatic swings in this week's news. Also, Germany is now the world's largest creditor nation, and China has left the developing world facing a, quote, tidal wave of debt. How are these two nations using their economies to dominate the world? We're going to look at all this and more on today's Trumpet World. We got news of a new Witkoff peace deal, a new ceasefire between Israel and Hamas this week. Hamas would give up 10 hostages and 18 dead bodies in exchange for a 60-day ceasefire, the release of hundreds of terrorists, and crucially, the Gaza food aid program being turned back over to the United Nations. We learned this morning that Hamas has apparently still said no to this. They want a permanent ceasefire, or this to lead to a permanent ceasefire. So to give us a rundown of all the negotiations and what's been going on this week, we'll turn to our Middle East correspondent, Mihailo Zekic.
Yes, you basically took the words right out of my mouth. As of this morning and the UK time, Hamas has rejected the ceasefire reportedly. The situation is changing on the ground, seems every few hours. But Israel, for its part, has accepted the ceasefire, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly having a meeting with the families of the hostages on Thursday, saying that, yes, we will try and get something going based off of the proposal that Witkoff gave us.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify on that, because I know as we were watching this unfold, there were members of Israel's cabinet coming out and saying, this is terrible, we don't like this, we can't agree to this. So Israel has agreed to this.
Yes, but we haven't heard from, say, some of the movers and shakers, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, a cabinet member I brought up before, that left the coalition before because of this kind of deal. So, and for their part, they're being really quiet suggests that maybe they're waiting to see what happens. If this is to go forward, we could very well see some coalition partners rebel and some more chaos brought in that brings everyone back to the negotiating tables.
Right. There's no point them throwing all the toys out of the pram and quitting the government if Hamas isn't going to agree to it anyway.
Yes, exactly.
So Israel just passed its 600 days since October 7th. This led to a big push in the Israeli media and even in protest movements on the streets to get these hostages home. I think both a push aimed at the international community to highlight Israel's suffering over these last 600 days, but also a push at the Netanyahu administration. There's a growing number of people in Israel saying, don't focus as much on defeating Hamas, focus more on getting the hostages back. That needs to be our primary aim. So what went into this deal happening, and where do you see us going from here?
Well, as you mentioned, Israeli public opinion is something the government is very sensitive about, and repeated polling suggests that most Israeli people agree to these kinds of deals, which is why Hamas took these hostages in the first place. Israel is a small country. Everybody's feeling the pain of these people, especially when you see the state of them when they come out. Hamas, for their part, you mentioned earlier that they've had a bit of a problem with humanitarian aid coming in. Israel had recently re-allowed humanitarian aid to come into Gaza, but not through the United Nations, instead through a private American NGO. The UN, we've talked about plenty of times on this program and on our website and the print articles, that the UN has done a lot to help facilitate Hamas's control over Gaza, and this includes basically letting them steal humanitarian aid for themselves and then sell the rest on the black market at exorbitant prices. This basically move by the Israeli government basically cuts off their supply lines, and is probably one of the reasons why they started agreeing to, okay, we want more ceasefire talks.
I mean, I think this is critical, this food issue, to the background to this deal. And it seems like a kind of genius move to me from Netanyahu. And I think this is why there's been such a strong narrative over the past few months of Israel is starving Hamas, or Israel is starving Gaza, because Hamas derives so much of its power from the fact that it controls the spigots to aid, just like you said, and every UN organization in Gaza is thoroughly infiltrated by Hamas. So Hamas controls the population because they control whether you get to eat or not. Israel now has come in as a major strategy of their war, working with American contractors to create an alternative distribution system for food. So you can now get food independent of Hamas by going to one of these Israeli sites. And this week, the UN has been especially screaming blue murder. But the narrative that Israel is deliberately trying to starve the Gazans to death, a completely false narrative, isn't random. It's a narrative being driven purposefully by Hamas, by their allies in Qatar and around the world, to try and defeat this attempt from Israel to take control of the food away from Hamas. And so this week you saw one of these distribution centers, or more than one, open up within Gaza. Then you had Hamas try to stop Palestinians being able to gain access to this site. Then you had people kind of bursting through the Hamas blockade, bursting onto the site itself. There has been a kind of a media war, a narrative war over what's been going on here. A Hamas kind of controlled UN warehouse was also stormed, both proving that you do have hungry people in Gaza, but also that Hamas has the food to feed them. They're just locked behind these warehouses, and there are unconfirmed reports, I think, of Hamas shooting people that were coming in there. So there's been a big media war over starvation and who's to blame this week. And control of the food is at the heart of this. And I think that's probably a key part of this deal, where Hamas is saying, we'll agree to this deal if you give us back control of the food supplies.
Indeed, and you could see just how complicit they are when Hamas is threatening people going to these Israeli centers. The food's coming from Israel either way, but if it comes through the UN, that's fine. If it comes through these other centers, you could get killed. That shows you there's an alternative narrative there.
One reason is that they're coming under a lot of pressure to bring hostages back. Definitely, you could see Benjamin Netanyahu, from his point of view, saying, okay, we pause the war for 60 days. I get 10 hostages back. That takes some of the public pressure off. And then in 2 months, we can resume going hard after Hamas.
Which a lot of people support.
Right. So that would be part of it. But then there's also the American involvement, the Witkoff involvement, that would also have to be a strong reason for Netanyahu to be considering this.
Very much so. You remember back in January when President Trump was inaugurated, he said he was going to solve all the world's problems. He was going to end the Ukraine war in a day, which never happened. He was going to end the Gaza war, which hasn't happened. And looks like he's getting quite impatient with all these people not listening to him and his platitudes of, let's all just sign a paper and get along. And Israel, as typical of administrations, is the easiest punching bag to get in line. On May 25th, President Trump told media that he wanted to see the Gaza war concluded fast. Last week, a White House official told Axios that, quote, the president is frustrated about what is happening in Gaza. He wants the war to end. He wants the hostages to come home. He wants aid to go in, and he wants to start rebuilding Gaza, end quote. Now, the whole reason the war is being continued is not Israel's fault. They just restarted their ground invasion. They've given themselves, according to media, a deadline of until October to finish Hamas once and for all. And if they haven't been having their arm twisted so much by the U.S., by the UN, by all these different groups, the war probably would be over right by now. There would be no more Hamas government in Gaza. They depend on America for protection and forums like the UN. They have to listen to the U.S. in certain respects. And looks like the U.S. is saying, okay, we want the war to end. We don't care how it's going to end. We just want the fighting to stop.
So very difficult position for Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he personally has the will to go and confront Hamas, to deal with this evil, to wipe them out. He's leading a nation, though, where I don't think the majority have that will. And he's got to manage this relationship with the United States that is pushing for peace. Now, clearly, we don't know what Hamas is going to do or say over the weekend, but more in the long term, where is this kind of peace and negotiation strategy leading?
Well, when President Trump put the first ceasefire deal against Israel in January, our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Fleury, had a lot of strong coverage about that, about how this was, I'll read a few quotes here. This is a catastrophic, monumental mistake. This deal has exposed Mr. Trump's flaws in a way that none of us want to see. Something is dreadfully wrong here. What Mr. Trump has done here is going to plague him for the rest of his tenure in office. Just watch and see if it doesn't happen that way, unless he dramatically changes course. And we can say with certainty that he hasn't dramatically changed course. He's still pushing these kinds of deals all these months later. You could look at everything that's happened in foreign affairs with America with their international presence, and Mr. Fleury has already been vindicated. the Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin, definitely respected Trump in his first term. There was a lot of things that he wanted to do that Mr. Trump pressured him not to do.
Well, he didn't invade Ukraine until Donald Trump was out of office.
Exactly. I think it's pretty safe to say Mr. Putin doesn't respect the Trump administration anymore. Iran. You can see them pushing the same kind of nuclear deal that they got Barack Obama to sign, the same deal that President Trump's backed out of and said it was a horrible deal. Now he looks like he's going to accept something extremely similar. America's adversaries saw what happened to Hamas, saw how this little group that didn't even directly threaten America basically pressure the U.S. to take their side, and now they're all following suit. And the fact that America is still, even regardless of whether a deal actually happens, the fact that America is still pandering to Hamas, pressuring its allies to stand down, which ultimately is going to create a lot more instability, again, regardless of whether the ceasefire ends any war, and is going to be a much more headache, not just for America, but for the whole world.
You brought up the Iran deal. I think we also had some news on that front this week as well.
Yes, on Wednesday, President Trump gave a press conference just before entering Air Force One, and he made this statement. We could play the clip.
Just back on Iran. Did you warn Prime Minister Netanyahu against taking some sort of actions that could disrupt the talks there in a phone call last week?
Well, I'd like to be honest. Yes, I did. Next question, please.
Mr. President, just last on sanctions.
I did, yeah.
If Senate Republicans want to push
It's
forward.
not a warning. I said I don't think it's appropriate.
What exactly did you tell him? Did
I
you
just said I don't think it's appropriate. We're having very good discussions with him, and I said I don't think it's appropriate right now. Because if we can settle it with a very strong document, very strong, with inspections and no trust. I don't trust anybody. I don't trust anybody. So no trust. I want it very strong where we can go in with inspectors. We can take whatever we want. We can blow up whatever we want, but nobody getting killed. We can blow up a lab, but nobody's going to be in the lab, as opposed to everybody being in the lab and blowing it up, right? Two ways of doing it. Yeah, I told him this would be inappropriate to do right now because we're very close to a solution. Now, that could change at any moment. Could change with a phone call. But right now, I think they want to make a deal, and if we can make a deal, save a lot of lives.
First off, we've been hearing rumors for a while, almost certainly intentionally leaked to hurt Israel's position, that Israel was about to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. You remember months ago they destroyed all their air defense systems, basically with impunity. They could do it at any time they wanted. Israel obviously does not trust the current negotiations that that's going to dissolve the problem once and for all, and they want to come in and solve the problem for everyone else, but President Trump is holding them on a tight leash. CNN had an article this week saying, quote, sources familiar with the discussions echoed Trump's optimism and told CNN that they are closing in on a broad agreement that could be clinched when the U.S. and Iran meet next, most likely in the Middle East, end quote. So whatever deal's being negotiated, it looks like most of the details are already there. Everything that's happening in the Middle East with the Palestinians, with Iran, with nuclear weapons, that ties into so many different avenues. I've talked on this program before about Zechariah 14 and how the day of the Lord, this time of intense trouble, starts with half of Jerusalem falling to the Palestinians, and that problems with Israel, dealing with the security, dealing with the Arabs, that's going to lead into a great crisis. You look at Daniel 11 and a prophecy of a king of the south, which what Mr. Fleury identifies as Iran. A king of the south pushing at its neighbors starts this same time period of intense problems and worldwide calamity. And Mr. Fleury has talked about nuclear weapons being a huge component of that. We're seeing President Trump in so many ways actually light the fuse for this explosion to blow up, empowering the Palestinians, empowering Iran, empowering these hostile actors in the Middle East. And regardless of which direction these individual events take turn each and every day, The fact that these countries can see what's going on, these enemies, that they see the help America is basically giving them, that is going to set off a powder keg that eventually is going to swallow up the whole world. And you and our managing editor, Mr. Joel Hilliker, have an article in this latest Trumpet edition that speaks of all the ways President Trump is helping fulfill these prophecies and many others by his foreign policy, by interacting with America's adversaries. I can help bring that into more context.
Yeah, that is a key theme of our latest Trumpet print. Under new management is the cover, talking about all the different, you've got a new chancellor, a new pope, a new Canadian prime minister, but then also a big segment in that is how Trump is transforming the world, the title of that article, where so many Bible prophecies are being set up right now by the way Donald Trump is dealing with these different bits of foreign policy. And that article will take you through and just show you how quickly Bible prophecy is being fulfilled at the start of this second Trump administration. Well, that was one big change of course we saw this week. Another one that we've seen over the last 24 hours or so, maybe a little more, is the Trump tariff situation, where a court struck down Donald Trump's tariffs. No tariffs on the rest of the world, or at least the general tariffs. Some of the specific ones like tariffs on cars or tariffs on steel, they were left in place. Very quickly we had another court come in and overturn that. So to get the latest on this situation, we'll go to Andrew Miller.
Yeah, I was talking with a colleague yesterday, Mr. Sam Livingston, about just how fast the justice system can move in situations like this. Normally, you stretch the appellate process out over weeks. But yesterday, we literally saw in less than 24 hours, a court strike down a pretty substantial decision Donald Trump made, an appellate court overrule that court, and an application to the Supreme Court being pretty much all wrapped up in one day. Just to recap what had actually happened, our regular listeners will probably remember back on April 2nd, Donald Trump announced his Liberation Day tariffs. That was a blanket 10% tariff on every nation on earth, and then some reciprocal tariffs on particular countries that were ripping the United States off. Now, normally, the Constitution gives Congress powers of the purse, so tariffs are enacted via congressional act. In this case, Donald Trump enacted them unilaterally by executive order under the International Emergencies Act. His exact words in the emergency declaration he filed were, "Large and persistent annual U.S. goods trade deficits have led to the hollowing out of our manufacturing base, resulting in a lack of incentive to increase advanced domestic supply capacity, undermining critical supply chains, and rendering our defense industrial base dependent on foreign nations." So basically declaring a supply chain crisis, saying that we're so dependent on foreign nations that it actually constitutes a national security crisis, declaring it as a national emergency, and then using the International Emergencies Act to remedy the situation. Now, the text of that act specifies that when you do that, you have to keep Congress updated to what actions you're taking every 6 months, and that the emergency is nullified if Congress declares it nullified by majority vote in both houses. Obviously, Democrats in the Senate didn't like this emergency declaration. The Senate met shortly after he made this emergency declaration, and they took a vote to overturn it. The vote didn't pass. There were 49 people who voted to uphold the emergency declaration and 49 people who voted to get rid of it. You would have needed 51 people to overturn it, so the vote stood until temporarily yesterday, where the U.S. International Trade Court came in and said that since Congress gives power, the Constitution gives power of the purse to Congress, President Trump does not have authority to enact these tariffs. And so they stepped in and did what the Senate could not, and said that he doesn't have a power to do this. And then a couple hours later, an appellate court temporarily overturned that decision, pending further review. So we will hear more about it. The main legal dispute, as far as I can tell, seems to be whether or fact is like, does the trade deficit constitute an emergency? Donald Trump says it does. The Senate's 50-50 divided on it, but since you need 51% to overturn an emergency declaration, that's not enough to undo Trump's emergency declaration. And then this 3-judge panel in New York says it does not, so they've overturned it and now pending up to the Supreme Court. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think this probably isn't going to have a ton of effects on Donald Trump's tariff policy. If it's overturned, there's other acts that mean that he might just have to tighten it up a bit. And instead of having a blanket tariff on all foreign nations, just declare communist China a threat or something like that and make it more targeted. But it's definitely a big development in Donald Trump's fight with the judiciary. I was reading the Federalist this morning, and they usually do a lot of their coverage of the fight with the judiciary. And some of the journalists over there are even taking the standpoint that these, what they call the judicial coup, or the fact that we've got all these district court judges who probably don't even have the authority to make nationwide injunctions. A district court judge's jurisdiction should be limited to their district, are overturning Trump's decisions. I think there have been 40 nationwide injunctions against the Trump administration made by district court judges since Trump takes office. About 35 of those 40 injunctions have came from the same 5 district courts. And so there's also brewing a pretty big legal debate over whether these district court judges even have that authority. Now, in this case, not to muddle the waters too bit, the U.S. Trade Court is not a district court. It is actually a court that oversees U.S. international trade. So in the tariff decision, the question's about, is this an emergency, not about does the International Trade Court have the authority to rule on international trade. But just looking at it as part of a bigger movement, I think you are seeing in a lot of these other injunctions the fact that the left, the radical left in America, they've lost control of the presidency, they've lost control of the Supreme Court, they've lost control of both houses of Congress. And so they're pretty much irrelevant, except if you have a leftist judge try to overturn the president. So in many cases, these judges are trying to push the limits of their jurisdiction quite far. And so like you see a case like we had when they tried to deport that Venezuelan immigrant, and you have a judge in North Texas issue a nationwide injunction against that deportation, then leading to the question of like, well, shouldn't your jurisdiction be limited to North Texas instead of actually making decisions for the whole nation?
Right. I think that's critical context. I agree on the trade point. Like, there's so many avenues available for President Trump to put in place tariffs that worst case scenario, if the court strikes this down, he'll just have to jump through a few more hoops. It might take a few weeks maybe to put it in place, or there'll be a few more steps, but he'll be able to get these tariffs through. I mean, I could see the European Union, someone like this, saying, okay, well, we were going to negotiate with Donald Trump. Now we're not going to negotiate. We're going to hope that some judges in the US bail us out. And then them not getting bailed out, and suddenly it's more of a crisis, and we've got kind of more of a scope for a trade war potentially between the US and EU. So it could have that kind of an effect. But exactly as you say, like, the overall picture here is important, because I think we can look at and debate particular rulings, and there is the question of, does a court even have a jurisdiction to get involved here when Congress does have a way to shut down President Trump's tariffs if they want to? Is that sufficient under the Constitution? Does a court even need to get, there are genuine questions there, but you put it in context of this judicial assault and a judiciary that was kind of the dog that didn't bark in many, many cases under Barack Obama, under Joe Biden, where there's a very clear double standard where these guys were allowed to get away with almost anything they wanted, while President Trump almost literally can't do anything. So where is this judicial war leading? How does that tie into Bible prophecy?
Yeah, prophetically, there's a couple different angles we can take this from. One is a point our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Fleury, made in his article, America's Broken Judgment, that was written shortly after the 2020 election, and there were some pretty credible allegations of fraud on the local level in that election, and there were at least 60 lawsuits filed wanting to look into the fraud, and none of the courts took that up. I don't think any of those lawsuits made it very far. Not because it was ruled that there was no fraud, it was just ruled that the court didn't even want to look at it. And so in the America's Broken Judgment, Mr. Fleury went through prophecies in Micah about just how corrupt the court system was prophesied to be in end-time America. Some of the analogies in that book in Micah, even likening it to cannibalism, where it's almost like you're putting someone in a pot and cooking them. The miscarriage of justice in some of these cases is so bad. And so and so now we're actually looking in America with some of these injunctions. And so it's like you're giving the criminals more right than the people. And some of these people are even MS-13 gang members who are committing horrific crimes. And so you're seeing just horrible miscarriages of justice in the American judicial system, like Micah prophesied. There's also, kind of on the other side of the coin, this prophecy in Amos 7 about the king's chapel and the king's court. So you've got Donald Trump, who our editor-in-chief has identified as an end-time type of the Israelite king Jeroboam, who is supported by two institutions, one called the King's Chapel and the other called the Kingdom's Court. And so, as our editor-in-chief brings out in the book America Under Attack, the King's Chapel is the religious movement that's supporting Donald Trump. But the King's Court, or the Kingdom's Court would be a better translation, is the Supreme Court or the legal system supporting Donald Trump. And I remember Mr. Fleury talking about this in messages all the way back in 2016, before Donald Trump was even elected, talking about him being a Jeroboam type and about the King's Chapel. And at the time, it was a pretty ground-shaking prediction, because Donald Trump wasn't, in 2016, Donald Trump wasn't really known as someone who had a great religious following. He didn't even really seem like that religious of a guy. And there wasn't really any indication that the courts favored him more than anyone else. But then after he was elected, and over the course of the past almost 10 years now, you've definitely seen him develop a very strong religious following amongst the evangelicals in America. And just because of the ferocity that the radical left's attacked him, the Supreme Court has to intervene time after time after time to uphold the law. And I actually, at least so far, I don't actually think the Supreme Court necessarily favors Donald Trump. I think it just favors the law, and in most cases, Donald Trump is on the side of law. And so it's another reason why I'm pretty interested in watching what the Supreme Court does rule in this tariff case. I mean, it's possible Donald Trump may have defined his authority under the Emergency Powers Act a little too broadly. But on the other hand, I don't think it's going to be a matter of like where these like 3 judges in New York can just outright strike down and saying that you have no authority to enact any tariffs under this act. So every time we see the Supreme Court have to intervene like this to clarify what power Donald Trump does have to do things like this, you're definitely seeing this this kingdom's court that's helping Jeroboam enact law in the United States in a way that our editor-in-chief was predicting well before any of these landmark Supreme Court cases happened.
Great, thank you for that. And of course, there's a lot of other events going on in the United States and the English-speaking world. Do you want to give us a rundown of some of the other stories?
Yeah, another, I think, was a pretty big story that caught my eye is just there's continuing investigations into how bad the corruption in the Biden administration was. We're finally to a point where even the liberals who are talking about how smart and how astute Joe Biden was are now admitting that yes, he had cancer, and yes, he's senile, and yes, he was in mental decline even during his presidency. There have been more revelations about the auto pen, not only clarifying that not only were almost all of his executive orders signed by auto pen, but there's now credible information that he may not have even known about many of the orders that were signed in his name. There's one report this week where they're actually identifying that, like, okay, well, if Joe Biden wasn't the one using the auto pen, who was? And we'll find more about that soon, but they've identified Ron Klain, who was President Biden's White House chief of staff for quite a while, Anita Dunn, who was a senior advisor to Joe Biden, and Robert Bauer, who was actually the former personal attorney of President Barack Obama, as well as Jill Biden, the first lady, and Steve Witkoff, a former counsel to President Joe Biden, as the 5 people most likely to have actually been using the auto pen to put Joe Biden's signature on presidential actions, whether or not Joe Biden was even aware that was happening. And then 2 other quick stories, both naval related. We follow the one of Herbert W. Armstrong's key prophecies was that he said that if the fact that the United States and Britain at one time controlled basically every maritime choke point on Earth is actually enough proof that we should be able to identify those 2 nations as the end-time descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh, even if you do nothing else about them. And the fact that they're losing those sea gates as proof that these nations have turned away from God's law, because God prophesied in Genesis that America and Britain would gain these sea gates, and he prophesied in Deuteronomy that they would lose them. So this week, the Great Britain signed away one of its last foreign military bases in the Chagos Islands, one of these last remaining sea gates in the Indian Ocean, as further fulfillment of that prophecy. And a report came out Wednesday that only 0.13% of the tens of thousands of large maritime vessels built globally are built by the United States. So not only are they losing the sea gates, but they're not even really building the ships anymore that use those sea gates. So you're not only reliant on using sea gates controlled by foreign nations, but your goods actually have to be shipped on foreign-built ships through foreign-controlled sea gates. And what's really just a loss of power on many fronts over the world's maritime trade.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. Well, to finish off the show, we've got a couple of stories about countries using debt to dominate. Our first really is that Germany has become the world's largest creditor nation. They overtook Japan to gain that title. Japan has held that title since 1991 when they took it off Germany. So Germany holds around 4 trillion in net external assets. So world's largest creditor, maybe a little misleading. It means that Germany or German businesses or German individuals, they own shares in foreign companies, they invest in factories and other industrial projects abroad, or they've loaned money to foreign governments, they own foreign bonds, or they've loaned money to foreign businesses. They influence a lot of economic assets outside of Germany. So Japan has had this kind of weird situation for the last, 20, 30 years, where they're also one of the most indebted major economies, but then because of the actions of all of these Japanese businesses, they're also the world's largest creditor. I like the German term of this, Credit Weltmeister. Germany is now the Credit Weltmeister. But this shows the amount of influence they have in other countries. It means that Germany plays a major role in global economics. It's a major source of foreign investment around the world. It does bring some risks to Germany. Germany is heavily invested in China, for example. China can use that against them. Hey, Germany, if you don't play ball with us, these Chinese companies that you've bought up, or these Chinese companies you've invested them in, these Chinese companies you bought up, these Chinese companies you've invested in, hey, we'll take that away from you. We'll confiscate that. So that would still be a major step for China to take, but it gives them some leverage. It means Germany is very much affected by what goes on in the rest of the world. But you look at what Herbert W. Armstrong said for decades, and you see that this is no accident. He wrote all the way back in 1945 that Germany would rise from the ashes of World War II and it would become a dominant economic and then military power, and that this economy and economic power would aid in its rise. What most do not know, he said, is that Germans have their plans for winning the Battle of the Peace. Yes, I said the Battle of the Peace. And we had an article about 20 years ago. That article was called Germany's Corporate Blitzkrieg by Mr. Robert Morley. And he wrote, peaceably through corporate mergers and acquisitions, German corporations are reaching out beyond the borders of Germany to gain control of strategic industry. Even Germany's most notorious World War II companies, which were severely disassembled and banned from future arms production by the Allies, have emerged as European and global leaders. And the article says, this time Germany will not have to first fight to control Europe. Europe will find itself under Germany's economic control. And really this new title, Credit Weltmeister, is a symbol of how successful Germany has been at that and how influential German companies are abroad. Proverbs 22 and verse 7 says the borrower is servant to the lender, and it's Germany that's been lending all around the world. And I think you look at that article talks about the dominance that Germany has in Europe. So Eastern Europe's economy is so ingrained into Germany. It's just their economy, almost so much of that revolves around making things that then get used in Germany's manufacturing industry and feeding up into the German supply chain. And you just look at big business in Europe. The Czech Republic's largest company is Skoda, which is owned by Volkswagen. Slovakia's largest company is Volkswagen Slovakia. Hungary's third largest company is Audi Hungary. Like, these are just German branches. Lidl is one of the top Eastern European companies. I think it was the Polish branch of Lidl. But then even these companies that aren't specifically owned by German companies, they may be Czech owned, but they make parts to be used in Volkswagen and BMW. And that's kind of practically what this Credit Weltmeister looks like. The whole of Eastern Europe is configured around the German economy. And so that gives Germany massive clout across Europe and across the world. And a few years ago, there was a new story that came out about how Angela Merkel didn't like this Nord Stream pipeline. She didn't like this gas pipeline with Germany, but she said she felt she had no choice but to agree to it because of pressure from German industrialists. And that was a statement that Mr. Fleury really drew a lot of attention to because of the role that German industrialists have played again and again in building up the German empire and German power, and because of the way that the Nazis specifically planned to go underground and use German industry. And he drew attention to a 1944 document where a lot of German businesses gathered together and they met in France and basically planned the Battle of the Peace. And there's a United States intelligence document that was declassified in 1996 about this meeting. And so many parts of this, like, they're reflected in this news about Germany being the credit Weltmeister. It said that these executives were told existing financial reserves in foreign countries must be placed at the disposal of the party so that a strong German empire can be created after the defeat. It says each industrialist must make contacts and alliances with foreign firms, but this must be done individually and without attracting any suspicion. I mean, that goes into Germany having this title. It says the Nazi party stands behind these industrialists and urges them to save themselves by getting funds outside Germany and at the same time advancing the party's plans for its post-war operations. I mean, getting its funds outside Germany, that's reflected in this new title. From now on, the government would allocate large sums to industrialists so that each could establish a secure post-war foundation in foreign countries. Like, establishing themselves in foreign countries was a core part of this German economic imperialism that was planned in 1944. And so when you see German industrialists bossing around the German government and German industrialists following through with these plans, that's something that we should take note of. And Mr. Fleury gave a key of David in 2001, where again, he really drew attention to this 1944 document. Here's what he said in that key of David program.
Now, these industrial barons, well, after World War was over, they went underground. They went into the bottomless pit. They just keep doing it over and over and over, and you never can clear the pit of this evil. They just keep right on coming until Jesus Christ personally stops this group of people. So, I mean, from the beginning, these German industrialists have led a double life. Now, you need to think about that. They've led a double life. If you look at their past, they were secretly collaborating fully with the Nazis, and then they went on to collaborate with them after World War II. And I'll show you evidence of that. There's ample evidence of it. Plenty of evidence. See, whatever, again, it doesn't matter what you call it, but it's really a very dangerous event. Industrialists like Krupp and many other outstanding German businessmen actively establishing great factories really all over the world to finance World War III. Can you believe that? Well, I'll show you. There's a great document that we have declassified that says exactly that.
And that's what this news story is really all about. And Mr. Fleury did go on in that Key of David to give a whole lot of evidence. He has an article, Rising from the German Underground, that sets out that evidence. But also in that article, he goes back to even the way prior to World War I, the role German industry played in building up the German Empire. And even before that, I think it talks about the Hanseatic League in that article. German industry has repeatedly played a major role in rebuilding the German Empire or in building up the German Empire. And so we have to sit up and take note when we see this, that German industry is doing exactly what they said they'd do in 1944 and investing and expanding abroad. And they are going to use those resources to help Germany rise. And, like I said, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of detail in that article, Rising from the German Underground. It's a great resource on what is happening in Germany. But Mr. Fleury was making those statements because of what Mr. Armstrong said, what was revealed to Mr. Armstrong from the book of Revelation and these other books of the Bible that describe what's happening in Germany. Here's just one clip from Mr. Armstrong talking about what we see happening now.
Now then, that Roman Empire is to be revived. It is coming out of what is called the bottomless pit. It's going to be resurrected, and it's going to last just a short time, and it'll be with 10 dictators in the territory of the ancient Roman Empire, Europe, and around the Mediterranean. There isn't any definite territory because the Roman Empire continued for many centuries, and at one stage it occupied one geographical location, and at another stage another geographical location. There isn't any definite set geographical outline that it must occupy, but it will be the old Roman Empire. Essentially, it will be fascist. You can be sure of that. And it is now rising, and it's going on underground, and we seem too stupid somehow to see it. We don't realize what's going on in the world. God says it's going to come up. But this, my friends, is the final resurrection of this whole system of Gentile empires and Gentile governments.
So he was talking about this underground empire. And he was writing that because of what the Bible says. He had no direct knowledge of what was happening in 1944. He didn't have these US intelligence reports that have now been declassified. But he knew this was happening because of Bible prophecy. And Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 17. These are critical chapters that give an entire overview of world history in advance. And they describe a European empire that rises and falls. And Revelation 17 and verse 8 talks about this beast. And it talks about it, going into the bottomless pit or going underground. It's called the beast that was and is not and yet is. And that's because at the time that God would reveal Revelation 17, and he would have a man that he reveals that to, the beast was an empire. It is not. It seems to have vanished to all appearances, and yet is. It's there underground. And Mr. Armstrong said it's there. It's underground. It's underground in the form of business leaders. I mean, Revelation 18, the very next chapter, goes on to talk about the merchants of the earth, the businessmen, and the role that they play in enabling and then growing rich from this empire. So, I mean, you could say, I think, that Germany, being this credit Weltmeister, it is fulfilled prophecy. And we're watching Germany, or we're seeing evidence of this underground empire, and we're seeing it rise up. And those overseas business links and that overseas business control is going to play a major role in the rise of this empire. And like I said, you can read more about that in Mr. Flurry's article, Rising from the German Underground. And you can get into those books of prophecy. Those are core books. I mean, God said that he gave them so that we can know God is in charge of world events. This is Satan's world. The Bible makes that very clear. But God is ultimately in control, and he's allowing all of these events to play out according to his plan. And like Mr. Armstrong said in that clip, this is the last resurrection of that Roman Empire. There's something very evil that is underground, but it's only going to come up for one more time. And those key books of Bible prophecy make that very clear too. And they all show how this points to Jesus Christ returning and setting up a wonderful kingdom, a wonderful empire, you could say, that governs over the whole earth. But Germany isn't the only nation using its economics to great dominance. We've got another report from China using that way less subtly, much more nakedly, to dominate the developing world. And we'll hear about that now from our Asia correspondent, Jeremiah Jacques.
The big story that I wanted to talk about from Asia this week is that thanks to China, the world's poorest 75 countries are now facing a tidal wave of debt repayments and interest costs. That is according to a new analysis published by the Lowy Institute. It was published on Monday, and this analysis is really quite chilling. It shows that this is all connected to China's Belt and Road Initiative. That is, of course, the brainchild of Chinese leader Xi Jinping. It's his project to spend billions of dollars in countries all over the world, building roads and bridges and railways and ports and electrical grids and all kinds of other infrastructure projects, all for the purpose of making the nations of the world better connected to China and actually more dependent on China. So Xi Jinping unveiled this plan back in 2013, and many countries just rushed to sign up. They thought, hey, this is great. China is giving us easy money, quick loans to build our countries up, to get us plugged in, to get us modernized, to get us connected to China's economy and other economies too. So the Belt and Road seemed like a sound idea, the way the Chinese presented it, and more than 100 countries ended up signing up. But here we are about 12 years on from the time when China first announced this, and it is now clear that these countries really should have read the fine print of these agreements that they were making with China. In country after country, it is now clear that the bridges and roads and ports that China built are not generating the revenue that was promised. And it's clear that the loans were structured in ways that are really overburdening these borrowing nations. If you look at the numbers here, it's quite alarming. Laos's public debt now has hit about 116% of its gross domestic product. Zambia's stands at 105%. Pakistan's is at about 80, and Kenya's is 70. And the majority of this is all owed to Chinese lenders. And dozens of other nations are in similarly bad shape. But the thing is, China itself is now also feeling quite a lot of economic strain, partly because of those tariffs that Andrew just spoke about a moment ago. So the Chinese are now saying, okay, you guys have to pay up right now. It's time to, repay us for what we lent to you. And what has ended up happening with some of these countries is that they have actually handed China control over some of their vital national assets to make up for not being able to pay China back. We've seen this in Sri Lanka with the Rajapaksa port. China was given 99 years of control over that. We've also seen it happen in Laos, which gave China a controlling stake over its extremely valuable electricity exporting electrical grid. And this new analysis by the Lowy Institute shows that many other nations could soon be added to the list of those that have to sign precious national assets over to Chinese control, since they just can't service their loans anymore. So it's very worrying because it shows that a dramatic shift is underway. And China is poised to become even more dominant in many regions as a result of this shift. And this broader shift is something that the trumpet carefully watches. And it's something that we've actually been warning about long before it was even nearly as evident as it now is, because it was foretold in biblical prophecy. There's a passage in Luke 21 that says in our modern era, the world would move into an epoch called the times of the Gentiles. And this means an age when America and Britain are no longer globally dominant, and instead nations such as China are globally dominant. And Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry has written a lot about this era over the years, and he has explained that China is a big part of it. And so when we see dozens of the world's poorest nations suddenly becoming beholden to China, deeply beholden to China, and having to even sign over their ports to Chinese control and their electrical grids and essentially becoming Chinese vassals, that's one area where we can clearly see this shift happening, this shift into the times of the Gentiles. And it shows that there are some really tumultuous times on the horizon. And for anyone who would like to understand more about the times of the Gentiles and how China factors into that and how the Belt and Road Initiative is a big part of that, we have an article that goes through all of that very carefully. It's called Why the Trumpet Watches, the Development of a Massive Anti-American Trade Bloc.
Thank you for that, Jeremiah. And I think it even ties into one of the stories Andrew mentioned about Britain handing over this Chagos Islands military base, Seagate, to Mauritius. Because I imagine they're one of the 75 countries, and they're a country that they're a victim of this. I don't know whether they've quite realized it yet, but I think they're one where China built their airport and they've invested massively. They're beholden to China. And so now with the Diego Garcia military base being owned by this country that itself is almost owned by China, or at least very heavily controlled there, and now Britain and America have to give them notice every time they use the base. Are they going to pass off that notice to China? China has relationships, say, with the Taliban, things like that. So now you've got this key military base for use all across the Middle East, and you've got a massive security vulnerability thanks to this relationship between China and Mauritius. And even the whole virtue of that base is to have a spot that, unlike other Middle Eastern military bases, you're not dependent on the kind of the good graces of a local government. Well, now we're dependent on the good graces of China. So this is something that has far-reaching implications when you kind of drill into every single one of these countries, and these countries may well host military bases, provide important bits of security. I think I saw one about Vanuatu years ago where China had built the prime minister or the president a brand new residence. And of course, okay, it's a poorer country. It's not massively influential. It is massive for Australia's security. And so for China to start moving into all of these different countries around the world is a critical part of their power and a critical part of the rise of the Gentiles. So thank you for setting it up in those terms for us. Did you have any other stories from Asia you wanted to bring today?
Yes. Yeah, I did. First up, a quick one about India. India just keeps on buying more and more Russian oil, and that is despite Western efforts to reduce the amount of oil that Russia is able to sell. India is now buying about 1.8 million barrels per day of Russian crude, and that brings India to a 10-month high with these energy imports. So it's a massive amount of oil that the Indians are buying from Russia, and this is a vital lifeline that it's throwing to the Russians. It's a major part of the reason why Russia is still able to finance its war against Ukraine. It's just a massive economic boon to Russia that lets it keep on paying its soldiers and keep on manufacturing artillery and weapons so that it can keep on slaughtering Ukrainians. And it shows us that as much as the United States would like to make a partner of India and kind of view India as a geopolitical friend, that is not the reality. India does sort of try to walk the tightrope between the two sides, but in this extremely crucial area, India is siding with Putin's Russia in a very significant way. And then the last story I wanted to talk about is that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been making a major outreach to Latin America. He's really been in overdrive over the last few weeks, just making overtures to these countries, signing deals to increase trade with them in some very dramatic ways. He's signed some major deals that increase China's purchases of exports from Brazil and Colombia. He's also ramping up state investment in both of those nations. And he has just launched a program that allows visa-free entry into China for nationals from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. And earlier this month, he even convinced Colombia to join the Belt and Road Initiative that we spoke about a moment ago. So China's making some serious inroads into Latin America, just deepening what was already very deep trade and influence. And that bodes ill for the security of the United States, for which Latin America, especially the northern parts, has long been a vital part of its sphere of influence.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Jeremiah, and to all of our guests today. Thank you to George Haddad and Victor Corneros for engineering and production. We'll be back on Wednesday with our video on YouTube, Rumble, over the air on 101.3 on the FM dial, on your podcast app, however you listen or watch. We're very glad to have you. If you have any questions, any comments, you can get in touch with us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. And until next week, keep watching your world.